everyone, welcome to Inside the Research. Today we have Elisa Gambino from the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. Welcome, Elisa.
Hi, thanks for having me, Pam.
You're welcome. So today we're going to be talking about your latest publication, which has been published on the International Affairs. How are you feeling about the paper, first of all?
I'm very excited about it, actually. It was a policy paper that came out as a way of getting my research out there faster. I think it's quite policy relevant, so I'm very excited to talk more about it.
Great. So your paper highlights the shift from trade to investment among private Chinese organizations in Ghana. How is this shift unfolding?
Yeah, so what the paper does and what I've observed in my research is that the landscape of Chinese companies in Ghana has changed dramatically over mainly the past 10 years, but even a bit earlier. So at the beginning of the 21st century, when a lot of Chinese companies started coming to Ghana, they were mainly in the import-export sector, so they were mainly trading finished goods manufactured and imported from China into local markets, engaging with local distributors and local traders. But increasingly, we see a lot more companies that are producing in local. This is due to a range of factors. Some of it is the fact that the local consumer market is expanding. And so a lot of shops, such as China malls, for example, have opened. But also, increasingly, Chinese companies have begun sourcing materials locally. A great example of this is Twyford Ceramics, a tile producer that now employs hundreds of workers across different parts of Ghana to produce tiles that are mainly sold on the domestic market, but some of them are also traded elsewhere. And this company was actually the first one to export under the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is quite relevant to the paper. But what this shift from trade to investment means is that now we're seeing a lot of Chinese-owned factories that are assembling, they're partially producing locally, and of different sizes. So other examples on the smaller end is, for example, a meatball factory. We also have PVC producers, consumer goods producers like plastic plates, bowls, takeaway plates, and similar. And these firms are very, very embedded in the local market. They mainly serve local consumers, and some of their inputs are sourced locally, and they also employ Ghanaians. There are still some challenges around localization, ensuring that there's not only quantity of jobs, but also quality. But overall, I'd say that this, with a meaningful localization process, this shift will, without a doubt, have an impact on Ghana's industrial landscape.
Okay, so you mentioned the prevalence of Chinese companies in Ghana. In your research, do you see that there are any socio-economic benefits of this phenomenon of, the prevalence of Chinese companies in Ghana? Do you think that they're being realized?
To some extent would be my short answer. So on the one hand, I think one of the most visible benefits is employment creation. There's more and more people employed in Chinese shops and Chinese factories. On the other hand, product availability is also a huge plus. This was very much the case, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And colleagues such as Heidi Hagen and Marco Bang here at the University of Ghana have worked on this as well. They showed how during the COVID-19 pandemic, because of the decrease in imports from other regions of the world, the availability of Chinese products on the market, and affordable products at that, was supporting everyday traders like women, small-scale traders, and street hawkers in still accessing the products that they could sell and continue making a daily living. The investments are also bringing some degree of technology transfer and managerial know-how, although this is very uneven and it depends a lot on the capacity of labor and the broader local economy and local firms to absorb the knowledge and the skills, as well as, of course, on the broader policy context. So the benefits are mixed overall, and my fieldwork showed that Chinese factories in particular, they are contributing to industrial output overall in terms of the Ghana's industrial sphere. but many of them are still operating with little local linkages, and so they keep importing a lot of the intermediate products or their primary materials from China. While others have had very little impact on developing local companies' capacities. Labor conditions are also way below expectations, and so while the presence of these companies has supported some expansion in Ghana's industrial base, the extent to which it contributes to longer-term industrialization and structural transformation is yet to be determined. And I think it really depends on how Ghana decides to regulate and support this process.
Okay. You talked about the challenges and the benefits. What do you think could be done to make sure that the benefits can be spread more widely locally, and what are the main barriers affecting developmental spillover?
I think it's a brilliant question. Actually, I think the benefits are not evenly distributed because a lot of these companies are operating sort of in isolation and are not particularly connected to domestic value chains, apart from the consumer market, of course, which is the largest market that these companies serve. And barriers, for example, include the main one, I think, is the coordination of industrial policy, limited local supplier capacity, but also patchy enforcement of existing regulations and such as investment and tax regulations. But I think in a way there's almost a policy paradox, right? So Ghana's investment regime is now focused so much on attracting foreign direct investment in the hope that it translates into broader socioeconomic development and structural transformation. But this connection is not guaranteed and it's not obvious. And especially the current investment attraction regime does not prioritize embedding and localizing the foreign investors in the economy. And so one of the recommendations that I give in the paper is actually to propose a milestone-based tax incentive regime, which can offer tax reliefs and tax holiday, but that are provided after there is measurable contributions to broader socioeconomic development, such as, for example, local sourcing, local employment, upskilling of local labor, as well as improving employment quality and complying with local environmental regulations.
Okay. So obviously manufacturing is the bedrock of industrialization for the continent. And with the shift from trade to manufacturing by these private companies, Chinese private companies, what does it mean for Ghana's industrialization agenda, particularly under AFTA?
So the African Continental Free Trade Area, I think, has both opportunities and risks. So on the one hand, while Chinese firms are moving from trading to manufacturing, Ghana really does have the potential to become a manufacturing hub in the region. It already has a quite high level of industrial capacity and production capacity around the country. So Ghana could leverage this additional investment from Chinese sources to build on their existing industrial capabilities and also position itself as a manufacturing hub. At the moment, Ghana already has over 400 Chinese manufacturing companies that have opened since the beginning of the 21st century. And this could really help diversify the type of experts that Ghana could have under the African Continental Free Trade Area and feed into regional value chains. However, the risk is that without coordinated regulations, especially amongst member countries of the African Continental Free Trade Area, these firms might end up actually capturing a large share of the market and also most of the value, while local integration with local companies remains quite weak. Some instruments, like, for example, the African Continental Free Trade Area Rules of Origins, which would average out more or less a 40% local content, which means that 40% amongst labor, sourcing, depending on the product, would have to be African, would mean that there would be a lot of potential to encourage Chinese firms to source locally and then export Africa-made goods across the continent.
Okay. Still on African continental free trade, what do you think is the consequence of having African-based Chinese companies' involvement in local production for intra-African trade? And what measures do you think that African countries or members of the African continental free trade can adopt to make sure that they have a smooth intra-African trade, or they're able to facilitate trade among themselves?
So I think the growing number of Chinese factories based in Africa and producing Africa-made Chinese products, arguably, it really does have the potential to strengthen intra-African trade. This is because these firms often have the capacity, the capital, and the logistics and the market reach to produce goods that are competitive in terms of their price and their quality within Africa. If their products meet AFCFTA rules of origins, these companies could become major suppliers of African-made goods to other markets and support regional value chain creation and intra-African trade. This could be the case in construction materials, plastics, and other consumer goods as well. But I think this requires a lot of coordination, and especially the setting of very clear standards on the part of AFCFTA and member states. If each country in AFCFTA is competing amongst each other, as was the case, for example, for transport corridor development or infrastructure development to capture trade, these can create risks, as it might lead to capital flight, meaning that businesses might move to other countries that have more ease of doing business or lower operating costs or better tax incentives, or it could lead to a race to the bottom, meaning that the minimum standards for labor and environmental standards and other social standards would be lowered. And this is, of course, a very big concern and a risk to the success of AFCFTA. I think AFCFTA can be harmonized in terms of trade regulations and coordinated investment frameworks to prevent this, and regional cooperation in terms of setting the standards, taxation frameworks, and industrial policy is essential to ensure that the benefits are shared amongst the member countries equally.
True. But there's that narrative that even if the Africans have or create their own manufacturing hubs, we still can't compete with China, because then obviously they produce more. In terms of pricing, they're better because they produce more. They're able to produce at a much cheaper price. How then do you think that we can integrate into the global value chain in competition with China when really there's really no competition? So my question is, how do we integrate into the global value chain as an African SME wanting to be involved in global trade? How do we navigate that?
I think there's different ways. I think on the one hand, when it comes to products produced in China at economy of scale, you do have much more competitive prices, as well as a much faster production line, which means that the feedback from consumers can be integrated quite quickly. And we've seen this type of competition play out in the context of trade already, right? So back in the days, maybe like 5-7 years ago, there used to be a lot of Ghanaian and other West African traders that would travel to China, select their goods, import them, and then distribute them in a wholesale level. But as Chinese traders have localized and have opened their own shops within markets like Makola or in a neighboring country, Togo, in Asigame, the local distributors have moved down the supply chain and have become sort of pushed out of their role as importer and distributors. And this has been a real challenge, right? It has been impacted by a lot of global dynamics, of course, issues around logistics and so on, during COVID-19 pandemic, but also lack of availability of funding here. And I think this is one of the crucial points for the manufacturing and small medium enterprises. There needs to be accompanying reforms to the banking system so that the small medium enterprises can access finance and funding that they would not be otherwise available to them. And I think there are many examples and lessons perhaps can be drawn from the examples such as the one of trade that perhaps could be scaled up more broadly and discussed in terms of manufacturing as well. One of them is on the side of policy, and so policies such as the GIPC Act of 2013, while not particularly effective in terms of the monitoring and the implementation, it has led many Chinese traders to move out of that sector, and manufacturing has been one of the places where they've moved. So this has been almost an unexpected and unintended consequence of the GIPC Act of 2013. And the second important point is about capacity of labor to unionize. I think one of the things I noticed in my research around traders with traders is that there was quite a lot of adaptation in specific sections of GUTA, the Union of Traders Association, especially in the part of people selling electronics and speakers and, as they say, anything that makes noise. This is for two reasons. On the one hand, because their clients are mainly churches, schools, or any program. And as such, this is a very peculiar part of the market. You need to have a lot of market knowledge and embeddedness and the connections with these organizations to be able to sell. And on the other hand, the people selling electronics and instruments came together and organized in order to continue, of course, competing amongst themselves, but then to have a united front in case Chinese sellers tried to set up shops selling the very same products. And so in this sense, there has been some sort of degree of adaptation, while others have begun sourcing entirely from Chinese-owned firms in Ghana, both in terms of their trading activities, but also by accessing machineries for production that was not available or affordable prior to the presence of Chinese companies. And as such, I think that there are new patterns of engagement amongst Chinese and Ghanaian actors that are emerging, that are shaped both by competition and to some extent by collaboration as well.
So, do you have any final thoughts on your paper since its release on the International Affairs?
I do, many. Okay. But I think to conclude our discussions, what I really hope this paper does is to bring a more nuanced understanding to the presence of Chinese private companies in Ghana and what their presence means for the AFCFTA. This is because there is a need to go beyond the old and usual narratives between threat or opportunity. And I think the AFCFTA can provide a new framework for thinking about localization of Chinese capital and potentially turning investment into regional value chain creation if states coordinate and ensure that there is institutional and policy coordination around the implementation of the AFCFTA. And because of the size of the Chinese presence in Ghana, it's really quite central that this is done in a very careful manner. I think Ghana's experience shows both the promise and the risk. And ultimately, my argument in this paper is that there's really the need to move away from just attracting foreign direct investment, whether it is Chinese or non-Chinese, and instead focusing on rooting these companies in the local market, in the local economy, and ensuring that they are contributing to skill development, to knowledge transfer, to taxation and domestic revenue collection, and also supporting and aligning with the development agenda of Ghana that is now very much industrialization-led.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it any better. Congratulations on your paper. Thank you so much for being with me for this episode of Inside the Research. Thank you for coming. It's great having you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Pam. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Great.